Imagine this. A powerful empire, unmatched in its might and ferocity, sets its sights on a small, seemingly insignificant kingdom. The Mongols, under the command of Kublai Khan, had conquered most of Asia with unstoppable forces. But when they tried to invade Vietnam, something unexpected happened. Instead of the Vietnamese surrendering, they fought back fiercely and cleverly, turning the tables on the Mongols. What went wrong? Why did the Mongols, who had conquered nearly every corner of the world, fail to defeat Vietnam? Stick around to uncover the surprising truth behind one of history's most unexpected military failures. In this video, we're going to dive into the heart of history and answer this question. Why did the Mongols fail to take Vietnam? You'll learn about the surprising military tactics used by the Vietnamese, how the landscape played a pivotal role, and why the Mongol forces, despite their size and strength, couldn't win. By the end, you'll understand how the little guy managed to stand up to the giant, and you might just be amazed at how clever and resilient the Vietnamese were in their defense. Stick with us as we unpack the Mongol invasion, from its mistakes to its ultimate failure. Before we get into the reasons why the Mongols failed, it's important to understand the context of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols had created an empire that stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of Europe. Their military tactics were revolutionary. They were highly mobile, using horseback archers and lightning-fast raids to strike their enemies before they could even react. By the time Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, took the throne in 1260, the Mongols were at the height of their power, and the world trembled at their approach. However, despite their dominance, the Mongols were not invincible, and this would become evident when they set their eyes on Vietnam. This small, relatively unknown kingdom in Southeast Asia seemed like an easy target. After all, the Mongols had already conquered much larger and more established kingdoms in the region. So, why did they fail to conquer Vietnam? The geography of Vietnam. One of the first major hurdles the Mongols faced in Vietnam was the country's geography. Vietnam, with its dense jungles, towering mountains, and vast river systems, was vastly different from the flat, open plains where the Mongols thrived. The Mongols had perfected their cavalry-based warfare, relying on fast-moving horsemen who could outmaneuver their enemies. But in Vietnam, the dense forest made it nearly impossible for their cavalry to operate efficiently. Vietnam's rivers were not easily navigable by Mongol ships, and the jungles were filled with hidden traps and obstacles. In fact, the geography of Vietnam was so difficult that the Mongols found themselves at a major disadvantage. Unlike their campaigns in open plains, where they could use their cavalry to launch devastating charges, Vietnam's terrain forced the Mongols to slow down, making their supply lines vulnerable. The dense forests also made it difficult for the Mongols to find and track their enemies. As they moved deeper into the country, they found that their typical military strategies didn't work, and they were forced to adapt to the unfamiliar environment. Vietnam's guerrilla tactics. While the Mongols struggled with the geography, the Vietnamese army was in its element. The Vietnamese had a deep understanding of their land, and they used this knowledge to their advantage. Rather than fighting large conventional battles, the Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics. They would set traps, ambush Mongol forces, and use the dense jungles to hide and attack with precision. General Tran Hung Dao, one of Vietnam's most brilliant military leaders, played a key role in the defense against the Mongols. His military genius was seen in his ability to use the terrain to create effective ambushes. The Vietnamese didn't have the strength to take on the Mongol army head-to-head, but they were masters of the hit-and-run strategy. They would strike quickly, and when the Mongols tried to retaliate, they would disappear into the forests and mountains, leaving the Mongols frustrated and confused. This kind of warfare was something the Mongols weren't used to. They were accustomed to battling large, organized forces, not smaller groups that struck swiftly and disappeared into the wilderness. The Vietnamese were also experts at exploiting their knowledge of the local environment. For example, they used the narrow paths and river systems to cut off the Mongol supply lines and force them to retreat. Leadership and unity. Another reason the Mongols failed to conquer Vietnam was the strength of leadership in the Vietnamese ranks. While the Mongols had a powerful military machine, The Vietnamese had skilled and committed leaders who were deeply invested in the defense of their homeland. Emperor Tran Tai Tong, the ruler of Vietnam, provided wise and strategic leadership throughout the conflict. He didn't just rely on military strength. He understood that the strength of the Vietnamese people lay in their unity and determination. The Vietnamese were fighting for their survival. Their homeland, their families, and their way of life were at stake. On the other hand, the Mongols were invaders who had already conquered much of Asia. Their motivation wasn't as personal as that of the Vietnamese, and it showed in the way the battles unfolded. The Vietnamese were united in their resistance, and this unity made them a force to be reckoned with. They were willing to endure hardships, fight in harsh conditions, and make sacrifices because they knew the stakes were high. In contrast, the Mongols, though formidable on the battlefield, lacked the same personal stake in the war. Their soldiers were highly skilled but didn't share the same connection to the land they were invading. Over time, as the campaign dragged on without decisive victories, morale among the Mongol troops began to wane. This lack of motivation played a key role in their eventual defeat. Logistical problems. Another significant issue for the Mongols was logistics. The Mongol army relied heavily on a system of supply lines to keep their forces moving. These supply lines would bring food, weapons, and other essentials to their soldiers, ensuring they could continue their campaign. However, Vietnam's difficult terrain and climate made it extremely hard for the Mongols to maintain their supply routes. The dense jungles and mountains made it nearly impossible to bring food and reinforcements in a timely manner, and the rainy season made the situation even worse. The supply lines were often cut off or disrupted by the Vietnamese forces, further weakening the Mongol position. The Vietnamese, on the other hand, were able to sustain themselves much more easily. They knew how to navigate the local terrain and make use of the resources available to them. While the Mongols struggled to supply their massive army, the Vietnamese could rely on local villages for food and support. This logistical advantage allowed the Vietnamese to continue their resistance without the same challenges that the Mongols faced. The Battle of Bac Dang River. The defining moment in the conflict came in 1288 at the Battle of Bac Dang River. By this time, the Mongols had made multiple attempts to invade, but each one had failed. The Mongol forces, exhausted and demoralized, were once again preparing for battle. General Tran Hung Dao, however, had one more trick up his sleeve. He set a brilliant trap for the Mongols, using his knowledge of the river and its narrow, winding path to his advantage. The Vietnamese forces lured the Mongol fleet into the river, where they had placed sharp wooden spikes hidden beneath the water. As the Mongol ships entered the river, they became stuck on the spikes, leaving them vulnerable to attack. The Vietnamese launched a devastating assault on the trapped Mongols, sinking ships and destroying their fleet. This decisive victory sealed the fate of the Mongol invasion, and from that point on, the Mongols would never attempt to conquer Vietnam again. Why the Mongols failed? In conclusion, the Mongols failed to conquer Vietnam because of a combination of factors: geography, guerrilla tactics, strong leadership, and logistical problems. The Mongol army was simply not prepared for the terrain of Vietnam, and their usual tactics didn't work in such a difficult environment. The Vietnamese, on the other hand, were deeply familiar with their land and used that knowledge to launch effective hit-and-run attacks. Their leadership was strong, and their people were united in their resistance. The Mongols also faced significant logistical problems, including disrupted supply lines and harsh weather conditions. Despite their incredible strength, the Mongols simply couldn't overcome these challenges. Vietnam's victory is a testament to the power of resilience, clever tactics, and leadership. It shows that even the mightiest empires can be defeated when they underestimate their opponents and fail to adapt to their environment. As the Mongols marched south toward Vietnam, their empire had already experienced significant military successes. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, his sons and grandsons, like Kublai Khan, continued to expand the empire, pushing deeper into Asia. By the time Kublai Khan came to power, the Mongol Empire was a superpower of the ancient world, and their reputation preceded them wherever they went. With the conquest of China in 1279, Kublai Khan became the emperor of the Yuan Dynasty, and he was determined to consolidate Mongol power in Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan's ambitions extended far beyond the borders of China. He sought to expand Mongol influence throughout Southeast Asia, including the Kingdom of Dai Viet. The Mongols had already encountered success in the region, particularly in Burma, modern-day Myanmar, and in parts of southern China. The Vietnamese kingdom, which had long been a part of Chinese history and influence, appeared to be a logical next target for Mongol expansion. But what the Mongols failed to understand was the unique history, culture, and resilience of the Vietnamese people. Unlike their other conquests, the Vietnamese had a long history of resistance against foreign invaders, especially against the Chinese. From ancient times, the Vietnamese had fought against numerous foreign powers, including the Chinese dynasties that sought to dominate them. This history of resistance instilled a fierce sense of national pride and unity in the Vietnamese people, who were willing to defend their land at all costs. This cultural resilience became a vital factor in the Mongols' failure. The Vietnamese were no strangers to war, and their military tradition was deeply rooted in their society. The Mongols, who were used to intimidating their enemies into submission, were unprepared for the unwavering resolve and resistance of the Vietnamese. Vietnamese society was also structured in a way that supported long-term resistance. The rural nature of Vietnam, with its scattered villages and fortified strongholds, made it difficult for the Mongols to conquer. Even as the Mongol armies advanced, the local Vietnamese population would often retreat into mountains and jungles, where they could continue to fight. This decentralization of power made it difficult for the Mongols to consolidate control and stamp out resistance. Another critical element that contributed to the failure of the Mongols was their underestimation of the Vietnamese military strategic abilities. While the Mongols were unmatched in their ability to win large-scale battles on open plains, they were ill-prepared for the kind of tactics that the Vietnamese employed. The Mongols favored direct confrontation, using their massive cavalry forces to overpower their enemies. But the Vietnamese army, under the guidance of General Tran Hung Dao, focused on strategic military actions that took advantage of the geography and the unpredictability of guerrilla warfare. General Tran Hung Dao was the mastermind behind some of the most successful campaigns against the Mongols. He was a military genius who understood the importance of surprise and deception. He also knew that the Mongols, despite their strength, relied heavily on maintaining communication and supply chains. By disrupting these vital lines of support, Tran Hung Dao was able to weaken the Mongols' resolve. He organized ambushes along crucial supply routes, cutting off reinforcements and food supplies, and making it increasingly difficult for the Mongol army to continue their advance. The Battle of Bac Dang River, which ultimately sealed the fate of the Mongol invasion, was a perfect example of Tran Hung Dao's brilliance in military strategy. The river itself became a key part of the defense. In 1288, the Vietnamese forces had prepared hidden stakes beneath the water, waiting for the Mongol fleet to sail into their trap. This was a classic example of how the Vietnamese, using their knowledge of the land, could manipulate the terrain to their advantage. The Mongols, whose naval capabilities were not as developed as their land forces, were trapped and forced into a humiliating retreat. Aside from military tactics, another important aspect of the Mongol failure was their overconfidence and lack of adaptability. The Mongols were used to success after success. They had crushed empires in kingdoms much larger and more sophisticated than Vietnam. This sense of invincibility made them underestimate the tenacity and resourcefulness of the Vietnamese people. The Mongols expected a quick victory, just as they had enjoyed in other parts of Asia. But Vietnam was different. The geography, the culture, and the spirit of the people turned out to be formidable obstacles that the Mongols had not anticipated. Furthermore, the logistical issues that the Mongols faced were compounded by the long distances and difficulty in communication. At the time, the Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and maintaining control over such a vast territory was no easy task. The Mongols had stretched themselves thin by this point in their campaigns. They were not only fighting in Vietnam, but also dealing with other threats, such as the Mongol invasions of Japan, which further drained their resources. This strain on the Mongol supply chain became a critical vulnerability that the Vietnamese were quick to exploit. The Vietnamese also took advantage of their allies, including the use of local knowledge and regional support. The Mongols, on the other hand, relied too heavily on their own empire's resources and failed to establish strong local alliances in Vietnam. They had no understanding of the local political landscape and were unable to win the loyalty of the Vietnamese people, many of whom saw them as foreign invaders. The Mongols, despite their military might, simply did not have the cultural or diplomatic tools to win the support of the Vietnamese population. Lastly, the failure of the Mongol invasion of Vietnam can be seen as a broader reflection of the limits of imperial expansion. The Mongols, despite their overwhelming military power, could not conquer every land they wished. Geography, culture, local resistance, and strategic mistakes all played a role in their inability to dominate the Vietnamese kingdom. Vietnam's victory over the Mongols was not just a military triumph. It was a symbol of how smaller, more resourceful nations can defy seemingly unstoppable forces when they are united, resilient, and clever. The Mongols would go on to face more challenges in their campaigns, but the defeat in Vietnam remains one of the most significant setbacks of their expansion. The loss demonstrated that no empire, no matter how powerful, could conquer all lands or subdue all people. Sometimes, even the mightiest forces must respect the land, the culture, and the will of those who defend it. So, the next time you hear about the Mongols and their conquests, remember the story of how they failed to take Vietnam. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful an empire may be, there are always forces, whether it's geography, unity, or ingenuity, that can tip the scales. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating stories like this one. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on more incredible historical insights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.